My name is Vivian Hale, and I am 62 years old. I have long silver hair that I wear pinned back with precision, and I've never left the house without my pearls, not even on that Tuesday night when everything changed forever. The hospital fluorescents hummed above me like angry wasps as I regained consciousness. I'd been unconscious for 3 hours after collapsing at the end of my 12-hour shift at the medical billing office. My body ached from hitting the concrete floor, but that pain was nothing compared to what was coming. The young nurse with kind eyes leaned over me, her voice soft with professional concern. "We called your son Mrs. Hale. We left several messages." I closed my eyes, not from pain, though my body ached from hitting the concrete floor, but from a familiar disappointment that had grown heavier with each passing year. Brandon hadn't come. Of course he hadn't come. Did he call back? I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Not yet, ma'am, but I'm sure he will." That was Tuesday night. Wednesday morning, my coworker Janet showed me her phone. Her face was pale, apologetic, but something in her eyes suggested she thought I needed to see this. "Vivian, I'm so sorry, but you should know." The Instagram post was time-stamped at 11:47 p.m., the night before, exactly when I'd been lying unconscious on a gurney. My daughter-in-law Carrara's perfectly manicured fingers held a glass of wine, her smile radiant against the backdrop of their expensive condo. The caption read, "Finally a day without the dramatic old hack. Sometimes the universe gives you exactly what you need." Hashtag blessed. Had peaceful evening, had no drama. I read it once, then again, then scrolled through the comments. Dozens of laughing emojis, friends agreeing how exhausting older family members could be. Someone writing, "You deserve this break, queen." The post had 847 likes. I handed the phone back to Janet and sat in perfect silence for exactly 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, something fundamental shifted inside me. The last thread of maternal grace snapped cleanly like pearls falling from a broken strand. "Janet," my voice steady as a winter morning, "would you mind if I made a private call?" I stepped outside into the parking lot, my fingers steady as I dialed the number I'd kept in my contacts but never used. Maris Duval, estate planning attorney. We'd met at a charity luncheon 2 years prior, and she'd given me her card with the words, "When you're ready to protect what you've built." Maris Duval speaking. "Miss Duval, this is Vivian Hale. We met at the Riverside Foundation luncheon. I need to schedule an emergency consultation." "Of course, Mrs. Hale. When would be convenient today?" "This afternoon." And Maris, "I'm done gifting grace. I need you to draft me a plan that breaks greed." There was a pause, then her voice returned sharper now, more interested. "I understand perfectly. Can you be here at 3? I'll be there at 2:45. I sat across from Maris in her corner office, my hands folded in my lap, my pearls catching the afternoon light. She'd called in her associate, a forensic accountant named Jonah Ree, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, who looked like he'd been born to count other people's money. "Tell me what happened," Maris said. I told them everything. The collapse, the hospital, the post, the 847 likes on my humiliation. Jonah leaned forward. "What assets are we protecting? 3 properties. The main house worth $1.2 million, a rental property worth $400,000, and a small cabin worth $180,000. Investment portfolio worth $23 million. 2 family LLCs I established for tax purposes. Approximately $200,000 in various accounts." Maris took notes. "Any legal vulnerabilities, powers of attorney, joint accounts. I made Brandon co-trustee on one family LLC when his father died 5 years ago." I thought, I paused. "I thought it showed trust." "That was your mistake," Jonah said matter-of-factly. "But we can fix mistakes." For the next 2 hours, we mapped out what Jonah called the architecture of consequences, an irrevocable charitable trust with ethics clauses, springing liens that would activate automatically, cross-collateralization agreements that would turn their greed into a noose. "How far are you willing to go?" Maris asked as I signed the retainer. I met her eyes. "To the bottom." That night I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made Brandon's birthday cakes for 34 years, and deleted every family photo from my phone. 20 years of Christmas mornings, graduations, Wedding photos. Gone. I learned the language of mercy from my mother. The language of math I learned from men who thought I couldn't count. Tonight, I preferred math. The next morning, I would begin building their coffin, and they would help me nail it shut. Thursday morning, I wore my navy suit with a pearl brooch armor disguised as elegance. Maris had called an 8:00 a.m. meeting, and when I arrived, Jonah had papers spread across the conference table like battle plans. "We've designed what I call a debt trap architecture," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Every piece appears separate, but they're interconnected. When one falls, they all fall." Maris poured coffee from an elegant silver service. "The beauty is in the timing, Vivian. They'll think they're winning right up until they realize they're buried. The first document was an irrevocable charitable trust." "Everything goes here," Jonah explained. "The house, the investments, the rental properties. But here's the key. There's a conduct clause. If any potential beneficiary is investigated for elder abuse, identity theft, or fraud involving you all, distributions freeze permanently." I nodded. "They get nothing. They get worse than nothing. They get liability." He showed me the second set of documents. "These are springing liens against both family LLCs. High-interest short-term notes that require balloon payments in 6 months. The only way to satisfy them is with your cooperation, which they'll never get." Maris leaned forward. "We're also filing sealed motions with probate court, a misconduct freeze that prevents any heir from claiming inheritance rights if there's evidence of abuse or fraud. It's like a legal landmine waiting to be triggered." The third piece was what Jonah called the fire sale protocol. "We liquidate everything fast, maybe 82 cents on the dollar, but speed is worth the discount. Cash goes into defensive accounts and the trust. By the time they realize what's happening, there's nothing left to grab." "How long?" I asked. 2 weeks, maybe less if you're committed." "I'm committed." Over the next hour, they explained the mechanics. Every meeting would be recorded. Every document would be notarized with video backup. I would speak 3 specific sentences on camera about my mental capacity and freedom from duress, creating an ironclad record for future court proceedings. "What about inheritance advances?" I asked. "Brandon's always looking for easy money." Jonas smiled the first time I'd seen him show emotion. "That's the beautiful part. There are companies that specialize in high-risk estate advances, predatory lenders who target impatience. The interest rates are devastating, and they require personal guarantees." Personal guarantees. Brandon would be personally liable for every penny, whether he inherits anything or not. "And based on what you've told us about his character," Maris finished the thought, "greedy people make predictable choices." I signed document after document. Trusts, liens, fire sale authorizations, bank notifications. With each signature, I felt lighter, as if I were shedding years of accumulated disappointment. "There's one more thing," I said as we finished. "They forged my signature last year to get a credit card. I never reported it because he's my son." Jonah and Maris exchanged glances. "Do you have proof?" she asked. I opened my purse and withdrew a credit card statement I'd hidden away. Brandon used my social security number and forged my signature on the application. He thought I'd never find out. "This changes everything," Maris said. "This isn't just about cutting them off anymore. This is about justice." That afternoon, I walked through my house, the house where I'd raised Brandon, where I'd nursed his father through cancer, where I'd hosted 23 Thanksgivings. I started packing family photos into boxes. The wedding photos from Brandon and Carrara's wedding went in first. I remembered that day. How beautiful Carrara had looked. How proud I'd been to welcome her to our family. The photos of family vacations I'd paid for. Christmas mornings where I'd watch them tear through expensive gifts I'd carefully chosen. Each photo went into the box with mathematical precision. No sentiment, no lingering, just sorting and packing. Kindness leaves doors ajar. Contracts lock them. That evening, I received my first text from Brandon in 3 weeks. "Mom, we need to talk about your retirement planning. Kara has some great ideas about maximizing your assets." I deleted it without responding. By Friday, the machinery was in motion. Jonah had identified the perfect buyer for my rental property, a cash investor who could close in 10 days. The main house would be trickier, but he'd found a buyer willing to pay asking price for a 30-day close. "They're going to panic when they realize what's happening," Maris warned. Good, I said. Panic makes people reckless, and reckless people make mistakes. I spent Friday evening at home sipping tea from my grandmother's china, watching the sunset paint my garden gold. Tomorrow I would begin dismantling everything I'd built. Not to destroy it, but to save it from people who thought love was weakness and generosity was stupidity. The last photo I packed was from Brandon's high school graduation. I was standing behind him, my hands on his shoulders, both of us smiling at the camera. I looked at that younger version of myself, still believing that sacrifice was virtue, that giving more would somehow inspire him to become more. That woman had been wrong about many things, but she'd raised a son who would be predictable in his greed. And predictability, I was learning, was a weapon. If they tried an inheritance advance, they'd sign their own noose. I just had to make sure the rope held. Monday morning brought the movers. I'd scheduled them for 900 a.m., knowing that Brandon and Carrara would be at their usual weekend brunch that stretched into Monday afternoon. Mimosas and avocado toast while discussing their next vacation. I stood in my driveway, pearl earrings catching the morning light, watching strangers carry away 34 years of memories. The dining room table where Brandon had done homework, the piano he'd quit after 6 lessons, the china cabinet filled with wedding gifts that had outlasted the marriage they celebrated. "Where do you want this, ma'am?" A mover held up a framed photo of Brandon's college graduation. "Donation box," I said, without hesitation. The real estate agent Patricia Wynn pulled up just as the last furniture piece disappeared into the truck. She was a sharp woman with intelligent eyes who specialized in high-value properties. "Vivian, darling, you sure about the timeline? 30 days is aggressive for a property this size. The buyer is paying cash at full asking price." "What's aggressive about that?" She smiled. "Nothing at all. I have the contracts ready." I signed a listing agreement in the same spot where I had once helped Brandon with his college applications. The irony wasn't lost on me. By noon, Jonah had liquidated my brokerage accounts. The capital gains tax would be substantial, but as he'd explained, freedom is expensive, but slavery costs more. The rental property closed the following Tuesday. Cash transaction, no complications. The buyers were a young couple who planned to live there themselves. Good people who would love the house the way I once had. Wednesday afternoon, my phone began buzzing. Brandon had driven by the rental property and seen the sold sign. "Mom, what's going on? Why didn't you tell me you were selling?" I let it ring. He called 6 more times. On the 7th call, I answered. "Vivian." "Mom, it's Brandon. What the hell is going on? The rental house has a sold sign, and Mrs. Patterson from across the street says there were movers at your house yesterday." "That's correct." Silence. "Then, what do you mean that's correct? Where are you moving? Why didn't you discuss this with us, Brandon?" "I'm sending you one letter. All future communications will go through my attorney." "Your attorney, Mom." "What?" I hung up. The letter arrived at their condo via certified mail on Thursday. "Brandon, do not contact me directly. All communications must go through my legal counsel, Maris Duval and Associates. Vivian." That evening, Carrara went live on Instagram from their condo balcony. I watched from my phone sitting in my nearly empty living room. "So some family drama is happening," she said, her voice honey with practiced concern. "But don't worry, we're going to be moving into the main family house soon. Sometimes older family members get confused about finances, and that's when the younger generation has to step in and help." She winked at the camera. "More space for content creation." The comments poured in. "You're such a good daughter-in-law. Family first." "Can't wait for house tours." I screenshotted every comment. 20 minutes later, I posted my own video. Not on social media, I never had accounts, but directly to my phone's camera. Insurance Maris had called it. Evidence. My name is Vivian Hale. Today is Thursday, September 14th. I am 62 years old, of sound mind and body, acting of my own free will, with no duress or coercion. I am making financial decisions to protect assets I've earned through 40 years of work. No one is influencing these decisions. I am fully competent to manage my own affairs. Friday morning brought the sold sign on my main house, the one where Brandon had learned to walk, where I'd nursed him through chicken pox, where I'd waited up nights during his teenage years. I was having coffee at the kitchen island when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Estate advance up to $2.5 million available for qualified heirs. Pre-probate funding. Quick approval process. Click here to schedule consultation. I smiled. Jonah had been right. Predatory lenders had algorithms that scraped public records for estate sales and property transfers. They'd found Brandon automatically. I forwarded the text to Maris with a single word. Started. Her response came immediately. Beautiful. The trap is baited. That afternoon, I signed the final paperwork for my cottage, a small oceanfront property I'd purchased with cash from the fire sale. 2 bedrooms, a garden, and a view of endless water. No ungrateful children who thought my collapse was an inconvenience. Saturday evening, as I unpacked my pearls in my new bedroom, my phone chimed with a notification. Someone had tagged me in a social media post, though I had no accounts. Patricia Wynn had posted a celebration photo. Sold in just 12 days. Another happy client at Wynn Real Estate. The background of her photo showed my former house with its bright red sold banner stretched across the front yard. I could only imagine Carrara's face when she saw it. They thought I was the field where they could plant their greed. They learned I was the fence that would keep them out forever. Sunday morning, I made myself breakfast in my new kitchen eggs Benedict with fresh herbs from my tiny garden and read the newspaper in peaceful silence. No interruptions, no demands, no performative family drama designed for social media consumption. My phone showed 17 missed calls from Brandon and 4 from Carrara. I deleted all of them without listening. At 2:47 p.m., I received an email notification. Brandon had clicked Schedule Call with the Inheritance Advance Company. The hook was set. Dorian Pike's office occupied the top floor of a gleaming downtown tower, all glass and chrome, with a bowl of money green mints on his reception desk. I'd never met the man, but Jonah had done his research. Pike specialized in estate advance solutions for impatient heirs with interest rates that would make loan sharks blush. I sat in my cottage garden Tuesday morning reading Jonah's intelligence report while drinking coffee from my grandmother's china. Pike's company, Inheritance Bridge Capital, had a 94% default rate. Their contracts were masterpieces of legal predation, packed with personal guarantees, cross-default clauses, and collection mechanisms that could strip assets faster than a pack of wolves. Perfect, I murmured to myself. According to the surveillance report Maris had commissioned, Brandon arrived at Pike's office Monday afternoon wearing his most expensive suit, the one I'd bought him for job interviews 3 years ago. Carrara waited in the lobby, live streaming her nails being done by a mobile manicurist. Pike, according to his secretary, whom Jonah had befriended at a coffee shop, greeted Brandon with practiced warmth. "We don't call it debt," he'd said, gesturing to the city's skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. "We call it a bridge to your future." The contracts were thick as dictionaries, filled with cross-collateralization clauses, first-position liens, and what Pike cheerfully called performance incentives. Penalties that doubled monthly if payments were missed. Brandon drunk on the promise of easy money signed without reading. DocuSign. Electronic signatures. All legally binding. The personal guarantees were ironclad. He was personally liable for every penny, regardless of whether any inheritance ever materialized. The first tranche was $350,000. After Pike's fees, they received $180,000. Within 12 days, according to credit monitoring reports, Jonah had legally obtained they'd burned through half of it. A BMW lease for Carrera, designer furniture, back taxes they'd been dodging, a consultation with Beverly Hills' most expensive plastic surgeon for Carrara's brand enhancement. When the money ran low, Pike introduced them to his short-term liquidity partner, Mauro Novak. I'd researched Mauro myself. Born in Montenegro, educated in the School of Broken Kneecaps, he specialized in urgent collection services for high-risk loans. His Yelp reviews were fascinating, very motivated to collect, and helped us understand the importance of timely payment. The first text from Mauro to Brandon arrived on a Wednesday evening. A photo of Brandon's car in his office parking lot timestamped 6:47 p.m. The second photo, sent at 6:51 p.m., showed the same car from a different angle, proving Mauro had walked around it. No words, no threats, just evidence of presence. Brandon called Carrara panicked. She called him dramatic and said he was manifesting negativity. Then Morrow sent a photo of their condo building. Same treatment, multiple angles, precise timestamps. Still no threats, just documentation. Thursday evening, Morrow appeared at their door. 6'4", knuckles scarred like tree bark, wearing an expensive suit that made his violence look professional. He brought flowers for the beautiful wife, he'd said to Carrara, his accent thick as motor oil. I am Morrow. We work together now. He sat in their living room for exactly 11 minutes, admiring their new furniture, complimenting Carrara's Instagram aesthetic, asking polite questions about their lifestyle expenses. When he left, he'd somehow conveyed the entire scope of their vulnerability without making a single explicit threat. The scuff marks from his shoes stayed on their white marble floor. Carrara scrubbed them for an hour but couldn't make them disappear completely. By Friday, their credit cards were maxed. The BMW payment bounced. Carrara's plastic surgery consultation was canceled when her deposit check was returned for insufficient funds. That evening, they received a formal notice from Pike's office. Payment number 1, due $47,500. Cure window 72 hours. They didn't have $47,500. They didn't have $4,750. Saturday morning, Carrara went live on Instagram, her usual perfect makeup slightly smeared. Sometimes the universe tests your resilience, she said, her voice shaking. But we're stronger than our challenges. The background of her video showed moving boxes. They were being evicted from the condo they'd never actually owned. Sunday night, Morrow sent one final text. A photo of himself standing outside their favorite restaurant, the one where they'd celebrated signing the inheritance advance papers. His massive frame filled the frame, and his smile looked like a crack in concrete. The message was clear. We know where you go, what you love, how you live. Monday morning brought a call from their bank. Mr. Hale, we're calling about irregular activity on your accounts. We've received fraud alerts from multiple sources and need to verify your identity before processing any further transactions. Their accounts were frozen. Their credit cards were declined. Their carefully constructed life of borrowed luxury crumbled in the space of a single weekend. That evening, desperate and cornered, they made the decision that would destroy them completely. They decided to unlock their inheritance themselves, using my social security number and a copy of my driver's license Brandon had photographed years earlier. They thought they were solving their problem. They were walking into a trap I'd built specifically for thieves. Tuesday morning, I received a call from Detective Riley Cortez of the Financial Crimes Unit. Mrs. Hale, we need to discuss some irregular activity involving your identity. Would you be available for a meeting? Of course, I said, adjusting my pearls. I've been expecting your call. The endgame was beginning. Detective Riley Cortez was younger than I'd expected, with sharp eyes, and the kind of quiet intelligence that comes from years of watching people lie. We met at a coffee shop near the courthouse. Neutral ground, she'd said, though I suspected she wanted to observe me in a casual setting. Mrs. Hale, we've received multiple fraud alerts involving your identity. Your son and daughter-in-law have been active. I sipped my tea and waited. Patience, I'd learned, was a weapon. They've made several attempts to access accounts, open credit lines, and claim inheritance payments using your personal information. Are you aware of this activity? I suspected, I said carefully. Brandon has used my information before. I chose not to prosecute at the time. Riley leaned forward. At the time, I'm older and wiser now, Detective, and significantly less forgiving. She smiled. Would you be willing to cooperate in a controlled operation? We've been tracking inheritance advance fraud for months. Your case could help us catch bigger fish. What would that involve? We set up a sting, let them think they're about to receive a large payout record. Everything and arrest them in the act. Clean, simple, airtight. I nodded. I'm very interested in airtight. That same morning while I was meeting with Detective Cortez, Brandon was having his own crisis. Dorian Pike's first payment was due in 36 hours, and they didn't have it. Morrow had started calling every 3 hours, his voice polite, but increasingly pointed. Brandon, my friend, I drive by your beautiful building this morning. So many nice cars in the parking garage. Makes a man think about values, you know. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. their BMW, their neighbor's Mercedes, the building's entire parking structure, all potential collateral in Morrow's fluid interpretation of debt collection. Carrara tried to maintain appearances. Her Instagram stories that day showed her doing yoga on their balcony, promoting a mental wellness reset. But the comments had shifted. People were asking questions. Where's the house tour? Whatever happened to the family estate? You seem stressed lately, hun. Her follower count was dropping. Brand partnerships were being reassessed. The influencer economy built on aspirational perfection had no patience for visible struggle. Wednesday evening, Pike called personally. "Brandon, buddy, we need to discuss your payment schedule. I just need a little more time. The estate settlement is complicated. Time is expensive, friend. My associates are charging storage fees for patients." That night, unable to sleep, Brandon made the call that sealed his fate. Using a voice changer app on his phone, he called my old bank pretending to be me. "Yes, this is Vivian Hale. I need to access my account. I seem to have forgotten my password." The call was recorded. Every word, every lie, every desperate attempt to steal my identity was captured on the trapline Detective Cortez and I had established. But the bank representative, who was actually an undercover detective, played her role perfectly. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hale, but I need to verify some information first. Can you tell me your mother's maiden name?" Brandon guessed. "Wrong. And what was the name of your first pet?" "Another guess." "Also wrong. I'm having trouble verifying your identity, Mrs. Hale. Perhaps you could come into the branch tomorrow with proper identification." "No." Brandon's voice cracked with panic. I'm traveling out of the country. Can't we handle this over the phone? I understand your frustration, but bank policy requires." He hung up. Thursday morning, Carrara took a different approach. She drove to a different bank across town, armed with a fake ID she'd purchased online, and a story about needing to access her confused adult mother-in-law's accounts for medical expenses. This bank was also part of our sting operation. She lasted 6 minutes before the inconsistencies in her story unraveled. The fake ID was obviously doctored. She couldn't answer basic questions about my financial history. When pressed, she became aggressive, demanding to speak to someone who understands family emergencies. The teller, another undercover detective, remained polite and professional, while cameras captured every moment. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to wait here while I speak with my supervisor." Carrara waited 15 minutes before panic set in. She fled the bank, leaving behind the fake ID and a purse containing additional forged documents. By Thursday evening, their situation was desperate. Pike's payment was due at midnight. Morrow had begun driving past their building every few hours, each pass documented with time-stamped photos sent to Brandon's phone. That night, cornered and terrified, they made their final mistake. Using a check-kiting scheme between their last two functioning accounts, they tried to create artificial funds to pay Pike. Check-kiting is a federal crime. Banks have sophisticated systems to detect it within hours. Both institutions filed suspicious activity reports with the FBI by Friday morning. Friday afternoon, Brandon received a text that looked like salvation. "Estate inheritance release meeting scheduled. $400,000 available for immediate disbursement. Conference Room B, Metro Center Office Complex, Saturday 3:00 p.m. The text came from a number with official-looking authentication codes. The meeting location was real, a legitimate business complex, with security cameras and professional conference rooms. What Brandon didn't know was that the meeting was entirely fake, designed by Detective Cortez and her team. The room was wired with cameras. The money was marked bills from the police evidence locker. The estate attorney was an undercover FBI agent. Saturday morning, as Brandon prepared for his fake inheritance meeting, I sat in my garden deadheading roses and thinking about justice. The roses had been my mother's favorite. Deep red, perfectly formed, beautiful, but sharp enough to draw blood if handled carelessly. Much like revenge, I thought. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Cortez. "Everything's in place. Are you ready?" I looked out at the ocean, its surface calm and endless. "Yes," I texted back. "I'm ready." Brandon arrived at the Metro Center building that afternoon, wearing his most confident smile, carrying a briefcase filled with forged documents, and believing he was about to steal $400,000 from his unconscious mother's estate. He had no idea that every door he'd walked through had been deliberately opened for him, and that they all led to the same destination, a federal prison cell. The trap was about to close. Saturday, 3:30 p.m. Metro Center Office Complex Conference Room B. I wasn't there, of course. I was home tending my garden and occasionally checking the live feed Detective Cortez had arranged on a secure tablet. The video quality was excellent, every detail crystal clear. Brandon entered the conference room exactly on time, his confidence restored by the prospect of easy money. He wore his navy pinstripe suit and his father's watch, the one I'd given him after the funeral, back when I still believed in the power of meaningful gestures. The fake estate attorney, Special Agent Lisa Chong, posing as Attorney Williams, greeted him with professional warmth. "Mr. Hale, thank you for coming. I understand there are some urgency issues with your mother's estate." "Yes, absolutely." Brandon settled into his chair. "She's been confused lately, making irrational financial decisions. The family is concerned about her capacity. Everything was being recorded. Every lie, every calculated manipulation, every attempt to paint me as incompetent." Agent Chong nodded sympathetically. "That's unfortunately common with elderly clients. Now I've prepared the inheritance release documentation. The amount available for immediate disbursement is $400,000, as discussed." She slid a stack of official-looking papers across the table. Brandon barely glanced at them before signing with flourish. "I'll need you to verify your identity and your authority to act on behalf of Vivian Hale," Agent Chong continued. This was the crucial moment. Brandon could have admitted he had no legal authority to act on my behalf. He could have acknowledged that I was mentally competent and had explicitly forbidden contact. He could have walked away. Instead, he doubled down. "I have power of attorney," he lied, producing a forged document. "My mother granted me full financial authority after her episode at work." He signed his name as Vivian Hale by Brandon Hale, attorney in fact. Federal forgery, identity theft, wire fraud. Agent Chong handed him an envelope thick with cash. "Here's the disbursement. I'll need a receipt." Brandon's hands shook slightly as he signed the receipt, acknowledging possession of marked federal funds obtained through fraudulent representation. "There's one more thing," he said, his confidence growing with the weight of money in his hands. "My mother might call asking about this transaction. She's been having memory issues. Sometimes she forgets conversations we've had. If she seems confused about the release, just, be gentle with her." "Of course," Agent Chong said smoothly. "We understand family dynamics can be complicated when cognitive decline is involved." Brandon smiled. "Exactly. Sometimes you have to protect people from themselves." Those words, "protecting me from myself," were recorded in high definition with timestamp and GPS coordinates. As Brandon left the building, counting money he'd stolen using forged documents and false representations, Detective Cortez watched from an unmarked car across the street. "Target has left the building with marked funds," she radioed. "All units stand by." Brandon drove straight to their condo, where Carrara was waiting with champagne and a live stream setup. She'd already posted a big announcement coming soon teaser that had generated hundreds of anticipatory comments. They never got to make their announcement. At 4:27 p.m., as Brandon proudly showed Carrara the envelope of cash, federal agents and local police surrounded their building. The arrest was swift and professional. No drama, no resistance, just handcuffs and Miranda rights. But Carrara, panicking, made their situation infinitely worse. When she saw the police cars, Carrara grabbed my old purse, the one containing my backup driver's license and social security card that she'd stolen months earlier, and tried to flee through the parking garage. She made it exactly 2 blocks before patrol units stopped her. When officers searched the purse, they found not just my stolen identification, but also handwritten notes in her distinctive script, account numbers, passwords, and what appeared to be a practice sheet where she'd been forging my signature. The evidence was overwhelming and immediate. Back at the condo, agents discovered Brandon's computer, still open to check kiting software and tutorials on emergency inheritance access. His browser history revealed weeks of research into identity theft methods, inheritance law loopholes, and elder abuse statutes, specifically searches for "how to prove elderly person incompetent." Detective Cortez called me that evening. "It's over, Mrs. Hale. We have them on multiple federal charges. wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, bank fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The evidence is ironclad. I was arranging white roses in a crystal vase, a simple pleasure I hadn't enjoyed in years. What happens now? Arraignment tomorrow morning. Given the flight risk and the evidence of ongoing fraud, I expect bail will be denied for Mrs. Carrara Hale. Your son might get bail, but with the amount of debt he's carrying and Mr. Novak's interest in collection, he may be safer in custody. And Pike Riley chuckled. Dorian Pike is cooperating fully with our investigation. Turns out he recorded every meeting with your son, including several where Brandon explicitly stated he planned to access your accounts without permission. Pike's handed over everything to save himself from RICO charges. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine, the expensive bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion. This seemed special enough. Sunday morning, I watched the arraignment coverage on local news. Brandon and Carrara in orange jumpsuits standing before a federal judge who read charges in a voice as final as a closing door. The prosecutor outlined the case with mathematical precision. The defendants engaged in a systematic pattern of identity theft and fraud targeting Mrs. Vivian Hale, including forgery, bank fraud, and elder abuse. The government has recordings marked currency-forged documents and digital evidence spanning several months of criminal activity. Carrara's attorney requested bail, emphasizing her community ties and lack of prior criminal history. The prosecutor responded by showing the court screenshots of her social media posts, including the dramatic old hack post that had started everything. Your Honor, Miss Carrara Hale publicly celebrated her victim's medical emergency and has demonstrated a pattern of exploitation and contempt. She is a substantial flight risk. Bail denied. Brandon's attorney made a more sophisticated argument about presumption of innocence and community ties. But when the prosecutor mentioned Maro Novak and the ongoing debt collection threats, the judge's expression hardened. Mr. Hale appears to be in danger from his own criminal associates, the judge observed. For his own safety, remand is appropriate, bail denied. That evening, I received a collect call from the county jail. I didn't answer. I would never answer a call from either of them again. Tuesday brought news that made everything perfect. Dorian Pike's company had collapsed overnight. Federal regulators had frozen all assets, voided all contracts, and opened investigations into hundreds of predatory loans. The inheritance advance industry was facing congressional hearings and potential criminal liability. Maro Novak, suddenly exposed and facing RICO investigation, had disappeared entirely. His last known location was a flight to Montenegro with no return ticket. Brandon and Carrara's debt, the crushing, unpayable obligation that had driven them to crime, had evaporated along with their creditors. But it didn't matter. They were looking at decades in federal prison regardless. Wednesday afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Agent Chong, the woman who had posed as the estate attorney, stopped by my cottage. Mrs. Hale, I wanted to thank you personally. Your cooperation helped us close a major case involving inheritance fraud. But I have to ask, did you know they would go this far? I offered her tea, which she accepted. We sat in my garden surrounded by roses and the sound of waves. Agent Chong, I said carefully. I knew my son was predictably greedy, and my daughter-in-law was performatively cruel. I knew they had used my identity before. I knew they felt entitled to money they hadn't earned. Beyond that, I paused to sip my tea. I simply provided opportunities for them to reveal their character. She nodded slowly. The beauty of this case is that we didn't entrap anyone. We just waited for them to commit crimes they were already planning to commit. Exactly. After she left, I walked to the edge of my property where my garden met the beach. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, fishing boats returned to harbor, their day's work complete. Justice, I reflected, was remarkably similar to fishing. Patience, proper bait, and the wisdom to let the fish hook themselves. Tomorrow would bring the formal indictment. Next month, the trial. In a year, the sentencing. But tonight, for the first time in decades, I felt completely at peace. The trap had closed perfectly. The debt had been collected in full, and I had finally learned the most important lesson of all. Some people will always mistake your kindness for weakness right up until the moment they realize they were wrong. By then, of course, it's far too late. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in October. with golden leaves falling outside the courthouse windows, like fragments of broken promises. I wore my charcoal gray suit with a pearl pendant, dignified but not celebratory. This wasn't a moment for triumph. It was simply the completion of a transaction. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Brennan opened with devastating simplicity. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a mother who collapsed at work and a son who saw opportunity in her unconsciousness. He played Carrara's Instagram video first. The courtroom was silent as her voice filled the space. Finally, a day without the dramatic old hack. The timestamp showed clearly posted while I lay unconscious in the ER. Several jurors visibly recoiled. Next came the recorded phone call where Brandon impersonated me. His voice artificially deepened, fumbling through security questions about my own life. The jurors listened to him guess at my mother's maiden name, my first pet's name, the street where I grew up, getting each answer wrong while trying to steal my identity. Then the parking lot footage from the fake ID incident. Carrara, in designer sunglasses, confidently walking into the bank with forged documents, her Instagram-perfect smile never wavering as she attempted to commit federal fraud. The pièce de résistance was the sting operation video. Brandon, in conference room B, signing my name with practiced ease, lying about my mental capacity, accepting marked federal funds. And then the moment that made one juror audibly gasp, smiling as he said, "Sometimes you have to protect people from themselves." Defense attorney Patricia Walsh did her best with an impossible case. She painted Brandon as a concerned son worried about his aging mother's erratic financial decisions. She suggested Carrara was simply naive following her husband's lead, but then prosecutor Brennan called Maris Duval to the stand. "Miss Duval, you met with Vivian Hale on the day after her collapse. What was her mental state? Completely lucid, articulate. She understood complex financial concepts, made logical decisions, and demonstrated perfect recall of her assets and their values. In my professional opinion, Mrs. Hale was more mentally sharp than clients half her age. Did she express any confusion about family relationships or recent events?" Maris looked directly at the defense table. None whatsoever. She was very clear about her son's history of financial exploitation and her daughter-in-law's public humiliation of her medical emergency. Her decisions were calculated, rational, and legally sound. The defense tried to argue that I was vindictive, that I had set up my own son out of spite, but prosecutor Brennan had anticipated this. Mrs. Hale didn't force Brandon to forge documents. She didn't make him impersonate her to banks. She didn't tell him to accept stolen federal funds or lie about her mental capacity. Every crime in this case was a choice made freely by the defendants. Detective Cortez testified about the check-kiting scheme, the fake ID purchases, and the systematic pattern of identity theft stretching back months. Jonah Reese, my forensic accountant, walked the jury through the money trail. How Brandon and Carrara had spent stolen funds on luxury items while claiming concern for my confused financial state. But the moment that destroyed them came from an unexpected source. Brandon's own phone. The FBI's digital forensics expert, Agent Torres, had recovered deleted text messages between Brandon and Carrara. Messages sent during the week of my collapse while I was still in the hospital. Brandon to Carrara Hospital called again. "Not going. Let the old bat sweat." Carrara to Brandon, "Good. Maybe this will teach her who's really important." Brandon to Carrara. "When she kicks it, we get everything anyway. Why pretend to care now?" The courtroom was utterly silent as Agent Torres read those messages aloud. Even the defense attorneys looked stunned. Carrara started crying. Not the pretty Instagram-worthy tears she'd perfected for her videos, but ugly, desperate sobs that shook her entire body. Brandon sat motionless, his face gray as ash. The jury was out for exactly 2 hours and 43 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, as the defendants were led away in shackles. Carrara turned to look at me for the first time since the trial began. Her eyes were wild with desperation and rage. "I hope you're happy," she screamed across the courtroom. "I hope destroying your own family was worth it." I met her gaze calmly and said nothing because happiness wasn't the point. Justice was the point, and justice doesn't require an audience's approval. That evening I cooked dinner for myself. Salmon with herbs from my garden, a glass of crisp white wine, fresh bread from the bakery in town. simple pleasures that tasted like freedom. The next morning brought an unexpected call from Brandon's defense attorney. "Mrs. Hale, my client, would like to write you a letter. He's hoping for a reconciliation before sentencing. Perhaps you could write a letter to the judge requesting mercy." "No," I said simply. "I understand you're hurt, but he's your son." "No," I repeated, and hung up. 2 weeks later, Carrara's attorney tried the same approach. This time she suggested that family forgiveness might reduce the sentences for both defendants. "Miss Walsh, I said your client celebrated my medical emergency, stole my identity, forged my signature, committed federal fraud, and then tried to claim I was mentally incompetent. The time for mercy was before they committed those crimes, not after they got caught." Sentencing day arrived with the first snow of winter soft flakes that covered the courthouse steps in pristine white. I wore my navy coat with a fur collar, my grandmother's pearls, and my mother's wedding ring. 3 generations of women who had learned to be strong in a world that preferred them weak. Judge Harrison was thorough and methodical. The defendants engaged in a sophisticated scheme targeting a vulnerable elderly victim, the defendant Brandon Hale's own mother. The psychological cruelty displayed in their communications, combined with the systematic nature of their financial crimes, demands substantial punishment. He looked at Brandon first. "Mr. Hale, you have shown no remorse for exploiting your mother's medical emergency, or for the years of financial abuse preceding these charges. Your actions demonstrate a pattern of predatory behavior towards someone who loved and trusted you. The court sentences you to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently prohibited from serving as an officer or director of any corporation, and you are ordered to pay full restitution of $847,000. Brandon's face crumpled. 18 years. He would be 52 when he was released if he served his full term. Judge Harrison turned to Carrara. "Miss Hale, your public mockery of your victim's medical emergency demonstrates a level of callousness that shocks the conscience of this court. Your social media posts reveal someone who views other people's suffering as entertainment. The court sentences you to 22 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The additional time reflects the aggravated nature of your identity theft charges and your role in publicly humiliating the victim. 22 years. Carrara would be 50 when she was released, assuming she served her full sentence. The restitution orders were largely symbolic. They had no assets left to seize, no income to garnish, no future earning potential to claim. But the numbers would follow them forever, growing with interest, ensuring they could never truly start over. As they were led away for the final time, neither of them looked back at me. Perhaps they finally understood that some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. That evening, I received a small, neat envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a car title Brandon's BMW signed over to me by the U.S. Marshal Service as partial restitution. I donated the car to a local domestic violence shelter the next day. They could sell it and use the money to help women escape dangerous situations. Women who, like me, had learned that sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to stop protecting people who see your kindness as weakness. The legal proceedings were over. The debt had been collected in full. Now, finally, I could begin the rest of my life. 3 months after the sentencing, I received a letter from the federal prison where Brandon was serving his time. Not from him, I had explicitly instructed the facility that I would accept no communications from either inmate, but from the prison chaplain. "Mrs. Hale," it read, "your son has expressed deep remorse for his actions and is seeking spiritual counseling. He would very much like to write to you about his journey toward redemption." Perhaps you would consider I stopped reading and fed the letter to my fireplace. Redemption is a choice made before the crime, not after the consequences. That same week, I received a more interesting piece of mail, a check for $47,000 from the Federal Asset Forfeiture Program. Apparently, the government had seized luxury items Brandon and Carrara had purchased with stolen funds, designer handbags, jewelry, electronics, and sold them at auction. I deposited the check and donated an equivalent amount to the local financial literacy program for seniors. If my suffering could prevent other elderly people from being victimized by their own families, then perhaps there was purpose in it. Spring brought an unexpected visitor to my cottage. Patricia Walsh Carrara's former defense attorney appeared at my door on a Thursday morning, looking haggard and older than her years. Mrs. Hale, may I speak with you? I invited her in for tea, curious about her purpose. Carrara has been trying to contact you through multiple channels, she began. Letters, phone calls, other inmates' families. She's not adjusting well to incarceration. I poured tea from my grandmother's service, the china delicate as butterfly wings. I'm not surprised. Prison lacks the proper lighting for influencer content. Patricia Walsh winced. She's facing the reality of 22 years. She's had time to think about what she did, what she lost. She's genuinely sorry. I'm sure she's sorry she got caught. Mrs. Hale, I understand your anger. I set down my teacup with precise control. Miss Walsh, your client celebrated my medical emergency on social media. She stole my identity, forged my documents, and spent months planning to exploit what she hoped would be my death or incapacitation. Now she's sorry because she's facing consequences. She was young, she made mistakes. She was 34 years old enough to vote, old enough to marry, old enough to know that fraud is illegal. Don't infantilize her choices. Patricia Walsh left without accomplishing her mission. As she walked down my garden path, I heard her mutter, "God, you really are cold." Perhaps, but coldness, I'd learned, was just another word for clarity. That summer I received news through Maris Duval. Brandon had been transferred to a different facility after an incident involving another inmate who had recognized him from the news coverage. Apparently, even federal prisoners drew moral lines about people who abused their own mothers. Carrara, meanwhile, had been placed in protective custody after receiving threats from other inmates who had seen her viral old hag post. The hierarchy of prison justice, it seemed, had its own sense of poetic balance. I felt nothing about either development. Not satisfaction, not sympathy, just the quiet recognition that actions have consequences and consequences don't care about your feelings. In October, exactly 1 year after their sentencing, I received a call from a documentary filmmaker interested in telling my story. Mrs. Hale, your case has become a landmark in elder abuse prosecution. We'd like to interview you about the experience. No, thank you. We could protect your anonymity, change identifying details. My story is not entertainment, I said firmly. Good day. I hung up and went to tend my roses. They were blooming, magnificently red as garnets, perfect as justice, sharp enough to draw blood from the careless. Some stories don't need to be told. They just need to be lived. The following spring brought my 64th birthday, a milestone I celebrated quietly with champagne and homemade cake in my garden. 2 years had passed since that night in the hospital, when I realized my son wouldn't come. Almost 2 years since I'd made the call that changed everything. I was pruning my roses when the mail carrier arrived with a certified letter. Legal notice from the federal prison system. Brandon Hale, inmate number 47839, had died of a heart attack at age 46. No family had claimed the body. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in my desk drawer. That evening, I cooked myself a beautiful dinner and watched the sunset paint my ocean view in shades of gold and crimson. I felt exactly what I expected to feel. Nothing. Grief, I had learned, is reserved for people we've lost. I had lost my son years before he died. Lost him to entitlement, to cruelty, to the belief that love was something to be exploited rather than treasured. The person who died in prison was a stranger who happened to share DNA with the child I had once loved. 6 months later, I received word that Carrara had petitioned for compassionate release, citing the death of her husband and her own deteriorating mental health. The petition was denied. Federal sentences for aggravated identity theft have mandatory minimums that don't bend for inconvenient emotions. She still had 20 years left to serve. On quiet evenings, I sometimes wondered if she still thought about that Instagram post. Finally, a day without the dramatic old hack. Did she remember the 847 likes? Did she regret the cruelty? Or just the consequences? It didn't matter. Regret is a luxury reserved for people who still have futures. Carrara had chosen her path with perfect clarity, and now she would walk it to its end. I, meanwhile, had chosen a different path entirely. My cottage garden was featured in the local magazine that spring, a study in seaside serenity. The photographer captured my roses in perfect bloom, their beauty sharp-edged and enduring, like justice itself, like memory, like the peace that comes from knowing you survived people who mistook your kindness for weakness. 5 years after Brandon's death, I received an unexpected letter from the state attorney general's office. They were launching a new initiative to combat elder financial abuse using my case as the foundation for stronger legislation. The Vivian Hale Protection Act would create harsher penalties for family members who exploit elderly relatives, streamline the prosecution process, and provide better resources for victims. They wanted my permission to use my name. I gave it gladly. If my suffering could protect other grandmothers from their own ungrateful children, then perhaps there was redemption in it after all. The law passed unanimously 6 months later. I was invited to the signing ceremony, but declined to attend. I'd never wanted to be a public figure, a symbol, or a cautionary tale. I just wanted to be left alone to tend my garden and live my life. That same year, Maris Duval retired, and her firm handled the final details of my legal affairs. The irrevocable trust I'd established was performing beautifully. The investments had grown substantially, and the charitable distributions were helping dozens of organizations that supported elderly victims of abuse. You know, Maris said during our final meeting in 30 years of estate law, I've never seen anyone execute a more perfect defensive strategy. You didn't just protect your assets, you created a legacy that will help others for decades. Justice, I replied, should be sustainable. My cottage had become exactly what I'd hoped, a sanctuary where every morning brought the sound of waves and every evening painted the sky in masterpiece colors. I developed a routine. Coffee on the terrace at sunrise, tending my garden, reading in the afternoon, simple dinners prepared with ingredients from my own herbs and vegetables. The local librarian, a sweet woman named Grace, had become something like a friend. We shared recommendations for mystery novels, and occasionally had lunch at the small cafe overlooking the harbor. "Don't you get lonely?" she asked one afternoon as we watched fishing boats return with their daily catch. "No," I said and meant it completely. Loneliness requires missing people who were worth having around. I don't miss people who saw my kindness as permission to hurt me. Grace nodded thoughtfully. You know, there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. Exactly. That evening, I received a call from the federal prison where Carrara was serving her sentence. She had 17 years remaining and was requesting permission to write to me. Inmate Hale states that she has important information about additional crimes committed by her late husband. The warden explained. She claims she can provide evidence that might help other victims if you're willing to hear her testimony. It was clever, I admitted, using the promise of helping others to try to reestablish contact with me. But I'd learned to recognize manipulation in all its forms. The inmate can provide any information she has to the appropriate law enforcement agencies, I said. She doesn't need my permission for that, and she certainly doesn't need contact with me. She specifically requested, my answer is no. Please make a note in her file that I will never accept communication from her under any circumstances, and that any attempts to contact me through third parties should be treated as harassment. I hung up and poured myself a glass of wine, a crisp Sauvignon Blanc, that paired perfectly with the salmon I'd grilled with herbs from my garden. Some bridges once burned should stay ash. 3 years later, I learned through a news article that Carrara had died in prison. Suicide, according to the brief report. She was 49 years old and had been serving the 13th year of her sentence. I read the article once, filed it away, and went about my day as usual. I felt no satisfaction in her death, but no sorrow either. She had made choices, and choices have consequences. The final choice had been hers alone. That autumn brought my 70th birthday, which I celebrated with champagne, and a small cake decorated with roses from my garden. The same roses I'd been tending for 8 years, their beauty sustained by careful attention, and the understanding that some things require both patience and sharp edges to flourish. My phone rang that evening, a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Hale, this is Jonathan Pike, Dorian Pike's son. I hope you don't mind me calling." I remember Dorian Pike, the predatory lender who had trapped Brandon and Carrara in debt before cooperating with federal investigators to save himself from RICO charges. "What can I do for you, Mr. Pike? My father passed away last month. Cancer. Before he died, he asked me to contact you. He said he had something that belonged to you." I was intrigued despite myself. "What kind of something?" "Documents, recordings. He kept copies of everything from his business dealings with your son and daughter-in-law. He said, he said you were the smartest person he'd ever met, and he wanted you to have the files in case you ever needed them." 2 days later, Jonathan Pike arrived at my cottage with a manila envelope thick as a dictionary. Inside were audio recordings of every meeting Brandon and Carrara had with his father, copies of all signed documents, and detailed notes about their behavior and statements. "Why did your father keep all this?" I asked. Jonathan smiled ruefully. "He said that people who lie to banks will eventually lie to him, and he wanted insurance. But after the federal investigation, he realized he'd been dealing with someone who was 3 moves ahead of everyone else." "What do you mean he figured out that you'd orchestrated the whole thing? Let them think they were getting away with fraud while you built an airtight legal trap." He called it the most elegant revenge he'd ever witnessed. That evening, I listened to the recordings while sitting in my garden as the sun set over the ocean. Brandon's voice confident and cruel, explaining to Pike how his confused old mother would never know what was happening to her money. Carrara laughing about my medical emergency and joking about my eventual funeral. Their voices preserved forever, documenting exactly who they had chosen to be. I kept one recording, the one where Brandon said, "The old bat trusts me completely. She'll sign anything I put in front of her," evidence, if I ever needed it, of how thoroughly they had misunderstood both my character and my capabilities. The rest of the files I burned in my fireplace that night. Some things are better reduced to ash in memory. As I watched the papers curl and blacken in the flames, I thought about the young woman I had once been, the woman who had believed that love should be unconditional, that family loyalty was sacred, that kindness would eventually be rewarded with kindness. That woman had been wrong about many things, but she had been right about one. Some lessons can only be learned through experience, and some people will only reveal their true character when they think they're safe from consequences. The flames danced higher, consuming the last evidence of my son's betrayal and my daughter-in-law's cruelty. In the morning, there would be nothing left but ash, and the wisdom that comes from surviving people who mistake your love for weakness. I poured myself one final glass of wine and stepped onto my terrace where the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, dark and deep and utterly serene. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another day in the garden, another page in the life I had built from the ashes of the life they had tried to destroy. And that, I thought, was victory enough. This morning, as I write these final words, I am 82 years old. 20 years have passed since that night in the hospital, when I learned the true depth of my son's indifference and my daughter-in-law's cruelty. I am sitting in my garden, the same roses now magnificent with 2 decades of careful tending their thorns sharp as the day I planted them. The cottage that became my sanctuary is weathered but sturdy, its windows facing an ocean that changes color with every shift of light, but remains eternal in its vastness. Yesterday, a young journalist contacted me about writing an article for the 20th anniversary of what legal scholars now call the Hale case, a landmark in elder abuse prosecution that changed how courts handle family-perpetrated financial crimes. I declined the interview, as I always do. My story was never meant to be inspiration or entertainment. It was simply what happened when a woman finally learned the difference between being kind and being foolish. The mail this morning brought 2 items of interest. The first was a letter from the charitable trust I established 20 years ago, the one funded by the ashes of my former life. It has grown substantially over the decades and now provides $200,000 annually to organizations that protect elderly victims of family fraud. The trust has helped more than 3,000 people over the years: grandparents betrayed by their own grandchildren, widows exploited by stepchildren, elderly parents whose children saw inheritance as a right rather than a gift. Each person helped represents a small victory against the assumption that family ties excuse any cruelty. The second piece of mail was more intriguing. A royalty check for $847 from a law textbook that uses my case as a study in defensive estate planning. The amount made me smile. Exactly the number of likes on Carrara's dramatic old hack post all those years ago. The universe, it seems, maintains its own accounting system. I endorsed the check and walked to town to deposit it as I do every morning when weather permits. The walk takes me past the elementary school where children play at recess, their laughter bright as wind chimes past the bakery, where Grace, now in her 80s herself, still makes the best sourdough bread on the coast, past the harbor, where fishing boats rest between their battles with the sea. At the bank, the young teller recognizes me and smiles. "Good morning, Mrs. Hale." Another book royalty. Another book royalty. I confirm signing the deposit slip with the same steady hand that once signed documents of war against my own blood. The walk home takes me past the cemetery, where my husband lies buried, the only member of my family who ever truly loved me without conditions. I visit his grave monthly, bringing roses from our garden and updates about the life I've built from the wreckage of the life we'd planned together. 20 years, I tell his headstone today. 20 years since I learned that some people will mistake your love for permission to hurt you right up until they realize they were wrong. The marble is worn smooth by decades of weather, but his name is still clearly visible. Thomas Hale, beloved husband. Below it, an inscription I chose myself. He loved without conditions and expected nothing in return. The opposite in every way of the son who bore his name. That evening, I prepare my usual simple dinner. Salmon from the local fisher's, vegetables from my garden, bread from Grace's bakery. I eat by candlelight on my terrace, watching the sun paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson, the colors as magnificent as they were 20 years ago, when I first learned to find peace in solitude. My phone rings, a number I don't recognize, probably another documentary filmmaker or journalist seeking to turn my trauma into content. I let it ring. In the distance, a ship moves slowly across the horizon, its lights twinkling like earthbound stars. I wonder about the people aboard, where they're going, what they're leaving behind, whether they've learned the lessons I learned too late in life. After dinner, I settle into my reading chair with tonight's mystery novel, an English cozy mystery where justice always prevails and the guilty always face consequences. Fiction perhaps, but satisfying in its moral certainty. As I read, I think about the questions people would ask if I granted interviews. Do I ever regret what I did? Do I miss my family? Do I feel guilty about the outcomes? The answers are simple. No, no, and no. Regret is reserved for actions you wish you hadn't taken. I regret nothing about protecting myself from people who saw my kindness as weakness. Missing family requires having had family worth missing. I had a husband worth missing. I never had a son worth missing, just a man who shared my DNA and exploited my love. And guilt. Guilt belongs to people who cause harm. I didn't force Brandon to forge documents, steal my identity, or celebrate my medical emergency. I simply stopped preventing him from facing the consequences of choices he made freely. Before bed, I checked the locks on my doors, a ritual more habit than necessity in this safe seaside community. But security, I've learned, is as much about mindset as it is about deadbolts. In my bedroom, I remove my pearl necklace, the same strand I wore to that first meeting with Maris Duval, the same pearls that witnessed every signature that built my enemy's destruction. They gleam in the lamplight, smooth and lustrous and perfect, like justice, like revenge served with mathematical precision, like the peace that comes from knowing that some bridges should burn and some doors should stay locked forever. I place the pearls in their velvet box and prepare for bed, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow will bring another sunrise, another day in the garden, another page in the story I chose to write, after learning that some people see your love as permission to hurt you. They called me old. They called me dramatic. They called me a hack. I called my lawyer. And in the end, that made all the difference. The years that followed my 75th birthday brought a different kind of peace, one born not of vengeance, satisfied, but of purpose found. The Vivian Hale Protection Act had inspired similar legislation in 17 states, each building on the framework my case had established. Lawyers specializing in elder protection often reached out for guidance, and I provided discreet consultations through Maris's former firm. I became something of a ghost expert, never appearing in person, never giving interviews, but my influence shaped policy across the country. It seemed fitting that my most meaningful work happened in the shadows. After all, I'd learned the power of invisibility, how people underestimate what they cannot see clearly. For my 80th birthday, Grace organized a small gathering at her bakery. Only 6 people attended, the few I'd allowed close over the decades. None were family by blood, all were family by choice. We shared a cake decorated with sugar pearls and the finest champagne I could source. No photographs were taken, no social media posts created. Just quiet celebration among people who understood the value of privacy and the weight of endurance. That autumn, I received an invitation to lecture at the State Bar Association's annual conference on elder law. Normally, I would decline without hesitation. But something about this request felt different. Perhaps it was the timing, 2 decades exactly since my hospital collapse. Perhaps it was the letter itself, handwritten by a young attorney who specialized in representing vulnerable seniors and who'd studied my case in law school. I have never seen justice executed with such precision, she'd written. Your story saved my grandmother from a similar fate. I recognize the warning signs because of you. For 3 days, I considered her invitation. On the 4th, I called and accepted, with one condition: no recordings, no press, no photographs. Just me, speaking directly to the people who could make a difference. The conference was held at a beachside resort 2 hours from my cottage. I wore a gray suit, modest pearl earrings, and carried a leather portfolio containing my speech. The room fell silent when I entered. Many had speculated about me over the years, the woman who'd orchestrated one of the most sophisticated legal traps in elder protection history, but few had seen me in person. Good morning, I began. My name is Vivian Hale, and 20 years ago I collapsed at work after a 12-hour shift. What followed was a masterclass in betrayal, but more importantly, a lesson in protection. Today, I'm not here to tell you about vengeance. I'm here to teach you about architecture. For the next hour, I detailed the legal structures Maris, Jonah, and I had built, the interlocking trusts, the springing liens, the conduct clauses that had transformed my assets from targets into traps. I explained how predictable greed can be weaponized, how patience often succeeds where confrontation fails, how the best legal defenses are those the opponent never sees coming. Throughout my presentation, I noticed a woman in the 3rd row taking particularly detailed notes. She was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair, and the watchful eyes of someone who'd seen her share of betrayals. When the Q&A began, she was the first to raise her hand. Mrs. Hale, your case established that elder victims can be active participants in their own protection, rather than passive recipients of legal aid. How do we balance this empowerment with the reality that many elderly clients lack your extraordinary resources and foresight? An excellent question, I answered. The most effective protection isn't about wealth, it's about timing. Even modest assets can be secured with proper planning. The key is intervention before crisis documentation, before doubt, and structure before suspicion. We must teach our elderly clients that seeking protection isn't admitting weakness, it's demonstrating wisdom. After the session ended, the silver-haired woman approached me. Dr. Eleanor Ramsey, she introduced herself. I run the gerontology department at State University. We're developing a financial protection curriculum for seniors. Would you consider consulting? For the first time in decades, I felt something unexpected, the desire to engage rather than withdraw. Dr. Ramsey wasn't asking me to relive my trauma for entertainment. She was offering me the chance to transform it into education. I took her card and promised to call a promise I would actually keep. That collaboration led to the development of the Hale methodology, a 6-week course now taught in senior centers nationwide. The curriculum teaches elderly individuals to recognize exploitation patterns, document financial decisions, create defensive legal structures, and maintain dignity while securing assets. The course materials never mention my story directly, but my fingerprints are visible in every cautionary example, every protective strategy. As I approach my 85th birthday, I find myself reflecting on the nature of legacy. Most people think of legacy as what we leave behind: money, property, genetic material, passed to descendants. But legacy can also be carved from absence, shaped from what we refuse to surrender, defined by the boundaries we maintained. My legacy isn't Brandon or Carrara, or even the charitable trust that bears my name. It's the invisible barrier that now exists between predators and their elderly prey in every state where the HALE Act provides protection. It's the thousands of seniors who recognize manipulation before it costs them everything. It's the subtle shift in how society views aged wisdom, not as vulnerability to be exploited, but as experience to be respected. Winter brings storms to the coast, powerful swells that crash against the rocky shoreline below my cottage. I've always found comfort in watching nature's displays of controlled fury. This morning's storm is particularly magnificent: waves tall as houses dissolving into foam against immovable stone. The violence is spectacular, but contained destructive yet purposeful, like justice, I think, like vengeance properly executed. My phone buzzes with a text message from Dr. Ramsey. Our curriculum has been adopted by the National Council on Aging. Congratulations, Vivian. Your methods will protect millions. I text back a simple thank you and return to watching the storm. The wind has scattered rose petals across my terrace, crimson against wet stone. There's beauty in this destruction, too. These blooms sacrificed to winter's necessity. The bushes will return stronger in spring, their temporary barrenness essential to future flowering. Nature understands what humans often forget. Sometimes the most nurturing act is to withhold, to prune, to allow consequences their natural course. Kindness isn't always gentle. Sometimes it must bear teeth. The storm intensifies, rain lashing my windows like tiny fists demanding entry. I'm reminded of Brandon in those final desperate days, calling, texting, attempting to break through barriers I'd carefully constructed. The memory no longer carries pain, just anthropological interest, like studying an ancient civilization whose customs seem incomprehensible to modern minds. How strange to think I once believed his lies, once trusted his intentions, once prioritized his comfort over my protection. That woman, that earlier version of myself, seems as foreign to me now as the cultures described in the archaeology books lining my shelves. We are all, I suppose, archaeological sites of our former selves, layers of experience compressed into the persons we become. If someone were to excavate me, they'd find the strata clearly defined: the trusting daughter, the devoted wife, the sacrificing mother, and finally, the boundary enforcer, the justice seeker, the woman who learned that mercy without discernment is merely weakness disguised as virtue. The storm passes by evening, leaving behind a cleansed landscape and spectacular sunset. I bundle in a warm coat and walk the beach, collecting interesting shells and sea glass deposited by the turbulent waters. The beach always offers gifts after chaos, treasure revealed by disruption. Another life lesson hiding in plain sight. I find a perfect sand dollar intact despite its journey through crushing waves and carefully place it in my pocket. How remarkable that something so seemingly fragile could survive such violence. Strength doesn't always announce itself in obvious ways. Back at the cottage, I prepare a simple dinner and eat by candlelight, a habit that has brought me comfort through decades of solitary meals. The silence around my table isn't emptiness. It's peace purchased at considerable cost. I've learned to savor it like fine wine. My computer chimes with an email notification. A message from Jonathan Pike, whom I haven't heard from since he delivered his father's records nearly 15 years ago. The subject line reads simply, "You should know." Curious, I open it to find a brief message and attachment. "I thought you might want to see this. Found it while clearing Dad's storage unit." The attachment is a transcript of a recorded conversation between Dorian Pike and Brandon, dated 3 days before the sting operation. In it, Brandon reveals his ultimate plan. Once he accessed my accounts, he intended to have me declared mentally incompetent and moved to the cheapest nursing home that won't kill her outright. Pike asks what would happen if I contested the competency hearing. Brandon's response is chilling. That won't be a problem. We have a doctor who understands financial incentives. Once she's declared incompetent, she'll be given medication that ensures she stays that way. Modern chemistry is amazing like that. I read the transcript twice, then closed my computer. The information doesn't shock me. I'd always suspected Brandon's plans extended beyond mere theft, but seeing it confirmed brings a strange closure. The trap I'd set hadn't just protected my assets, it had preserved my freedom, possibly my life. The knowledge doesn't change anything, doesn't alter my past actions or future intentions, but it settles something deep within me. The last whisper of doubt that perhaps I'd overreacted, that perhaps there could have been reconciliation, dissolves like morning mist. Some betrayals are so fundamental they sever the possibility of return. Some bridges once burned leave only open air, where connection once existed. The void isn't tragic, it's necessary. I send Jonathan a brief thank you for the information and wish him well. Then I block his email address. The Pike chapter of my story is complete. No need for epilogues or postscripts. Spring arrives with unusual warmth, coaxing my roses to bloom early. I spend mornings tending them, afternoons, reading on my terrace evenings, walking the beach. Simple pleasures that have sustained me through 2 decades of solitude. Not all imprisonments involve bars. Some are built of obligation, expectation, manipulation. Freedom, I've learned, isn't just physical movement, but the ability to determine one's own boundaries. Dr. Ramsey calls with news that the Hale methodology has been translated into 12 languages. The international edition includes culture-specific modules addressing family exploitation patterns unique to different societies. She wants me to review the adaptations, ensure the core principles remain intact. What began as personal protection has evolved into global prevention. There's profound satisfaction in this expansion, this transformation of private pain into public shield. The universe may not inherently balance its accounts, but sometimes we can adjust the scales ourselves. On a particularly beautiful afternoon, I receive an unexpected visitor. A young woman, perhaps 30, stands at my garden gate, clutching a folder and looking nervous. Before I can ask her business, she speaks. "Mrs. Hale, my name is Andrea Lowell. Your case saved my grandmother's life." I don't invite her in. 2 decades of privacy aren't easily set aside, but I join her at the gate, curious about her story. "My father and uncle were doing exactly what your son did," she explains. "Draining accounts, forging signatures, planning to declare her incompetent. Then their lawyer saw your case reported in the Bar Journal and withdrew his services. He actually warned my grandmother what they were planning." "And what happened?" I ask. "She used your playbook. Set up a trust with conduct clauses, liquidated assets, documented everything. When they realized what she'd done, they threatened legal action, claimed she was confused. She played them the recordings she'd made of their planning sessions. They backed down immediately." Andrea extends the folder. "She asked me to give you these if I ever found you." Inside are photographs of an elderly woman tending a garden much like mine, letters describing her journey from victim to advocate, and a handwritten note addressed to me, Mrs. Hale. "You don't know me, but you saved me. Your courage became mine. Your strategy became my shield. I'm 92 now, and still living independently, still making my own decisions, still enjoying the garden my husband and I planted 60 years ago. My sons thought my age made me their property. You taught me through your example that wisdom doesn't diminish with years. It compounds like interest. With deepest gratitude, Margaret Lowell." I read the note twice, unexpectedly moved by this connection to a woman I've never met. For 20 years, I've avoided publicity, refused interviews, declined recognition. Yet somehow my story found its way to those who needed it most, not as entertainment, but as blueprint, not as tragedy, but as strategy. "Tell your grandmother I'm glad she found her strength," I tell Andrea. "And thank you for bringing me her message." After she leaves, I sit in my garden, considering Margaret Lowell and others like her, women who refused to become convenient victims, who transformed vulnerability into vigilance. We form an invisible sisterhood, our members connected not by meetings or membership cards, but by boundaries maintained and dignity preserved. That evening, I receive a call from Maurice Duval's former law partner. Vivian, there's been a development in the HALE Act amendments. The legislature is expanding coverage to include digital assets and crypto holdings. They want to name this section after you specifically, the Vivian Hale Digital Protection Clause. I'm surprised by the honor, but more interested in the practical implications. Will it cover social media exploitation, I ask? That's become a significant vector for elder humiliation. It will. The amendment specifically addresses public mockery and privacy violations. Carrara's Instagram post would trigger automatic protection today. 20 years later, the law still evolves to address new methods of exploitation. There's something profound in this ongoing adaptation, this living legacy that continues to grow long after the original events faded from public memory. I accept the naming honor, with one condition: my formal title must be Mrs. rather than Ms. A small detail perhaps, but important to me. The honorific represents a marriage that brought genuine love, a partnership based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Thomas would be proud of how I've carried his name. Summer brings record heat to the coast, driving tourists to the beaches in unprecedented numbers. I adjust my routine, taking my walks at dawn before the crowds arrive, tending my garden in the cool morning hours, spending afternoons in my climate-controlled cottage with books and classical music. Dr. Ramsey visits with preliminary results from the HALE methodology implementation. Financial exploitation reports among program participants have dropped 67% compared to control groups. Even more significant participants report higher confidence in managing their assets and establishing boundaries with family members. The numbers validate what I've always believed: education is protection. Knowledge transforms potential victims into informed defenders. The elderly aren't inherently vulnerable. They're simply targeted because predators expect easy prey. When autumn arrives with its cooler temperatures and spectacular foliage, I receive a letter from the State Bar Association. They're establishing a pro bono elder protection program and request permission to name it the HALE Initiative. The program will provide free legal services to seniors experiencing financial exploitation, with special emphasis on family-perpetrated fraud. I grant permission immediately and make a substantial donation to fund the program's first 5 years. Money has never been my primary concern. Even after the fire sale of my assets 20 years ago, I retained enough for several comfortable lifetimes. But seeing it directed toward meaningful protection brings particular satisfaction. The universe may not naturally balance its accounts, but sometimes we can weight the scales ourselves. Winter returns, my 85th birthday approaches, and I find myself reflecting on time's passage with neither regret nor nostalgia. The years since my hospital collapse have brought clarity rather than bitterness, purpose rather than resentment. What Brandon and Carrara intended as exploitation became transformation. Their betrayal forged me into someone stronger, wiser, more discerning about where to invest my trust and energy. Perhaps that's the most profound revenge, not merely surviving those who sought to diminish you, but flourishing because of the strength their challenges awakened. On a crisp December morning, I receive a package from the State Attorney General's office. Inside is a commemorative plaque honoring the 20th anniversary of the HALE Act and a letter detailing the legislation's impact: over 15,000 cases, prosecuted more than $500 million in assets, protected countless elderly individuals, spared the trauma of family betrayal. Numbers that transform personal pain into public good, individual suffering into collective protection. I display the plaque not out of vanity, but as reminder that purpose often emerges from our deepest wounds. What we survive, we can transform. What breaks us can become the foundation upon which others stand protected. That evening, as I prepare for bed, I perform my nightly ritual: checking locks, drawing curtains, placing my pearls in their velvet box. Security measures that have become comfort rather than burden. The cottage settles around me with familiar creaks and sighs, this sanctuary I created from necessity, now home in the deepest sense. Outside my window, the ocean stretches toward the horizon, dark and vast and eternal. Tomorrow will bring another sunrise, another day in the garden, another page in this unexpected chapter. I've written for myself. Not the life I planned, perhaps, but one constructed with precision, maintained with care, and ultimately lived with profound peace. I am Vivian Hale, 85 years strong, betrayed, but not broken, targeted, but not defeated. Once they called me old dramatic, a hack. Once they thought my kindness was weakness, my age was vulnerability, my love was exploitable. They were wrong. And in that mistake, they forged their own destruction and my most enduring legacy. The knowledge that dignity doesn't diminish with age, that boundaries aren't selfishness, but self-preservation, that justice, when properly executed, can protect generations beyond our own. Some lessons are purchased at terrible cost. Some wisdom comes only through fire. Some bridges once burned illuminate the path forward with unexpected clarity. I turn out the light and close my eyes, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow will bring another day in this life I've built from the ashes of betrayal. A life that proves with quiet certainty that the most powerful words an underestimated woman can speak aren't pleas for understanding or cries for mercy. They're simply this: I called my lawyer. And sometimes that makes all the difference.